hosted by the International Gas Union and the Clean Resource Innovation Network. We've got an exciting panel today to discuss the multi-sector collaboration and accelerating climate action and delivering the Global Methane Pledge, as well as the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Alliance recently announced here at COP. So to kick things off, I'm delighted to invite the President of the International Gas Union, Li Yalan, to the podium to provide some opium comments. Thank you very much.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As the President of the International Gas Union, it is my honor to welcome you all to this COP28 set event. IGU is a worldwide non-profit organization that has more than 90 years of history, and it has over 150 members from over 80 countries, covering the entire gas value chain and representing over 90% of the global gas market. Natural gas is the world's third largest energy source, accounted for 24% of the energy mix in 2022. But the gas industry also produces carbon dioxide and methane emission. I want to be clear. We recognize our role as part of the problem, but we are also a large part of the solution. We don't shy away from talking about the advantages of natural gas. It's an important solution to energy trilemma, energy security, energy sustainability, and energy affordability. The gas industry chain has a sound infrastructure system. Gas is the best partner of renewables. It helps to solve intermittency and instability of renewables by supporting integration of renewables into the power system. We also don't shy away from talking about the other part of the problem. Natural gas is a fossil fuel and leads to methane emissions. In the IGU's position paper on climate change and the future role of gas, IGU states that members will work to measure, reduce, and verify their greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and methane emissions. To reduce methane emissions, some of our members have set clear goals on methane abatement into their company strategies. Some innovations in methane abatement technologies and management have been adopted, such as using drones and laser radar to detect methane emissions, adopting flaring technologies in oil and gas exploration, using mechanical plugging equipment to reduce gas winding during maintenance and daily operation of gas pipelines, etc. The gas industry is constantly innovating in technology, which helps us dramatically lower methane emissions. However, we have seen some problems on methane emissions in gas industry. Some members fail to recognize the importance of reducing methane emissions, and progress is uneven. Some producers and countries lack the capacity to measure their emissions. It is difficult to obtain accurate data. We need further technology breakthroughs on methane emission reduction. We hope our speakers could focus on how different stakeholders can collaborate to further this progress, and how the Global Methane Pledge signatories can achieve robust targets, and also how to drive technological and managerial innovation in methane emission reduction. These issues require all of us to work together. IGU will, with our members, make great efforts to reduce methane emissions in the whole gas value chain and advocate the use of new gases. Today's event is collaborated efforts between the IGU and the Clean Research Innovation Network. Thank you all for being at this important conversation, and I look forward to the transparency discussions and to make a positive impact. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. Great way to open the panel. I'm pleased now to introduce the Director of Operations from the other co-sponsor of this event, Glenn McCrinnan from the Clean Resource Innovation Network, to provide some opening comments.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks everyone for being here today. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Clean Resource Innovation Network to be here and sharing the stage with the International Gas Union on this important topic. And you know, when I think about our topic today, and we're talking about multi-sector collaboration. Multi-sector collaboration is what the Clean Resource Innovation is all about. We bring together people that are the innovators with the people who are the adopters of technology, principally in the oil and gas sector and other hard-to-abate sectors, along with funders. That includes public and private funding mechanisms, people who support the innovation ecosystem, and ultimately the talent that's needed for innovation success to occur and for us to meet our climate goals in the future. The Clean Resource Innovation Network has two streams of activity, one focused on technology development and deployment. And we were fortunate to receive a grant of $100 million from the Government of Canada, 80 million of which goes towards funding a project. We're currently funding 68 different projects. And the key to that is that every project that we fund is a collaboration between an industry player and an innovator. So we have the built-in industry pull. Now, what I like to draw as a parallel to our event here today, and I would like to thank the UNFCCC for making this happen. When it comes to side events at COP, we're strongly encouraged to find others to work with and collaborate with and sort of pull together. And so that pulling together is very similar in my mind and analogous to what we do with regards to the innovators and adopters of funding. The second stream for the Clean Resource Innovation Network is around ecosystem development, and that's bringing those sectors that I talked about earlier together so that they can innovate and potentially work with people that they would not have otherwise gotten connected with. We're very proud of the work that we do. We think this topic today is super important around methane, the Methane Pledge, and the Clean Resource Innovation Network has 7 streams of technology focus. Everything from carbon capture and value-added products to digital to land reclamation. But important for this conversation today is around methane emissions detection and abatement. And so with that, I think I'll just pass it back to Kevin. Thank you so much for having us. We're proud to be here.
Thank you, Glenn, for those remarks. And now to set the stage around the challenge of methane emissions, which I'm sure is a topic all of us have been speaking about at length the past few days. I'm pleased to welcome Leslie Coldham, the Public Affairs Director for the International Gas Union, to provide some thoughts before we begin our panel.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this side event looking at the dynamic and increasingly dynamic daily landscape of global efforts to address methane emissions. Today we gather to explore the multi-sector collaboration needed to drive action on methane emissions and the commitment required from the energy sector, innovators, policymakers and financial institutions to achieve significant reductions worldwide by 2030. The gas industry contributes around 7% of total methane emissions attributable to human activity. At the same time, gas provides a key solution to tackling energy security, resilience, and environmental performance. It acts as a reliable, lower carbon backup resource as we integrate renewables. And together with renewable gases, decarbonized gases, and low carbon gases, can play an important role in helping to decarbonize other sectors. The risk of undermining the gas industry's argument about the role of gas as a cleaner transition fuel should be incentive enough to reduce our emissions. But we clearly aren't doing what's needed, and we have been reminded of this many times this week. And yet, the gas industry is at the forefront of developing and deploying technologies that can dramatically lower emissions and which can be deployed to reduce methane emissions in both our own and in other sectors. The gas industry also has the greatest potential for rapid and low-cost emission reductions. Success stories include substantial improvement in methane detection technologies through the development of advanced sensors and drones to help identify and locate methane leaks in pipelines and infrastructures, allowing for quick repairs. Optical gas imaging cameras visualize and detect methane leaks by capturing infrared images, making them easy to identify and repair. Smart sensors and devices are being used along pipelines to monitor pressure, temperature, and flow, and can help detect anomalies and potential leaks early on. Robotic devices capable of inspecting and repairing pipelines without human intervention can reduce the need for disruptive maintenance activities. Methane oxidation catalysts can be installed at various points in the gas infrastructure to convert methane emissions into less harmful byproducts or into valuable products such as synthetic fuels or chemicals. And of course, innovative methane capture technologies can capture methane emissions from various sources before they are released into the atmosphere. These technologies are becoming increasingly accurate, providing the gas sector with more and more information to tackle its emissions. The industry is also actively committing to reducing methane emissions under several global platforms, including the Methane Guiding Principles, the UN's Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, and the Aiming for Zero program of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. Now, the Global Methane Pledge was announced at the UN Climate Change Conference in 2021, and of course this week we've moved on quite a lot as well. Over 100 countries, including 3/4 of the IGU's member countries, have committed to the pledge, which of course aims to collectively reduce global methane emissions by 30% by 2030 compared to 2020 levels. The commitment includes actions such as improving measurement and reporting of methane emissions, enhancing technologies to reduce methane leaks in the oil and gas sector, and promoting sustainable agriculture practices to mitigate methane emissions from livestock. The active participation of the gas industry is pivotal to achieving this goal. But our progress is uneven, with many producers and countries not having the capacity to measure their methane emissions or to put strong reduction plans in place, let alone achieve them. Our question then today is how can different stakeholders collaborate to further the progress we have made, and how can we work together with the Global Methane Pledge signatories that need it to help them to develop and achieve robust targets. The gas industry alone and technology alone can't solve this challenge. It requires a holistic approach, also involving regulatory frameworks, industry commitment, and global collaboration. So I'm going to hand back to Kevin now to help us delve into these critical topics with our panelists. Thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to an enlightening discussion. Thanks very much, Kevin.
Perfect. Thank you, Leslie. And also, as part of my work as on the steering committee of the Clean Resource Innovation Network, I'm also pleased to be the sector lead for industry young professionals. I think we all know that to succeed in the energy transition, we will need a youth perspective. And I'm also pleased now to welcome by video Aaron Foyer, chair of the Canadian Energy Young Professionals Alliance. Video.
My name is Aaron Foyer. I am an energy transition researcher with a private equity fund, and by night I run a newsletter called Energy Minute, and we focus on energy, technology, and the environment. I'm based out of Calgary, Alberta, in Canada. Calgary is the heart of the Canadian oil and gas industry and has been for many decades. Like many young professionals, I am increasingly concerned about the effects of climate change. As such, panels like this are really encouraging as we see the open discussion of solutions that our industry can use to adopt and create new technologies that will help lead us to net zero emissions. As we all know, methane plays an outsized impact in global warming. Despite its small volume of emissions, because of its increased potency, it's responsible for somewhere between 25 and 30% of global warming. On the flip side, that also means that solutions for methane have an outsized impact. So we're really encouraged by a number of technologies that have come out that are low cost and seem to be able to scale globally that can address methane emissions. So for this reason, we are excited about this panel and the results that will come from this discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Aaron. Okay, now to the fun stuff. We could delve deep into these. We've got a unique perspective from NOCs, IOCs, collaborators, and management services insights. So really excited. So before we get started, maybe introduce yourself to the panel and the work that you're doing or your organization is doing broadly on the energy transition and perhaps more specifically around methane emissions reductions. I'll kick it off with Santiago Martinez.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Santiago Martinez. I'm the head of sustainability and decarbonization at Ecopetrol. For those of you who don't know the company, we're an integrated oil and gas company. So we are present in the refining, production, and midstream segments. We also acquired the largest energy transmission company in Latin America as part of our energy transition journey. And we now created a new business unit that is responsible for promoting low business solutions such as renewables, wind, solar, hydrogen, CCUS, and the like. So we are part of the OGDC charter that was launched here with other 52 companies. That means that we have our own targets on near zero methane emissions, zero routine flaring by 2030, and we are also committed to a net zero target to scopes 1 and 2. How are we proposing to do this? First, diversification is part of the agenda. We're also incorporated a carbon price as part of our strategy, and we are implementing a series of programs, particularly in the short term around energy efficiency, methane reductions, and a reduction of flaring. For the past 3 years, we've managed already to reduce 1.5 million tons of CO2 through these programs. So a third of it, around it, was methane. Around 12,000 tons of methane we have been reduced in the past 3 years. We've also recovered around 9 million standard cubic feet of gas that has been shifted to power as well. So all these initiatives are contributing to meet our medium-term reduction targets, which is a 25% reduction by 2030, scopes 1 and 2, compared to a 2019 baseline. We've managed already also to identify the methane emissions in 95% of our operated assets through different technologies, bottom-up, top-down. We're part of the OGMP 2.0, and we announced this week that we achieved the gold standard, so we're very happy that we are complying with that standard as well. So we've been very active in that space lately, and we are now also trying to collaborate with other NOC to tell our story and see how we can collaborate in this space even further.
Fantastic, thank you, Santiago. Matthew, introduce yourself and same question.
Good afternoon, Matt Kolesar with ExxonMobil. I am our Chief Environmental Scientist, and in that role, amongst other things, I get to coordinate our global methane programs from operational support, our research organization, and policy development, and so on methane. I guess just on the company's perspective, we've taken the position, sort of the end equation of the energy transition is continue to supply the world affordable, reliable, secure, and low carbon energy products that society needs, and provide services that lets the rest of society have choices to decarbonize. And so the first half of that I think is pretty straightforward that we'll talk about is how do I go decarbonize my facilities? And again, we've committed through OGDC and we had done a prior net zero greenhouse gas scope 1 and 2 by 2050, aiming for zero methane by 2030. But the second half of that is this suite of tools and services we can provide to society on low carbon hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration, biofuels, And most recently, what we're pretty proud of is now producing lithium, which is the skill set that we're utilizing to provide lithium in North America. Where methane fits into this and where I think the OGDC was so clever in its design was twofold. One is it expanded the membership of entities that were committing to this sort of next phase of reductions. But secondly, and this seems sort of obvious, but when you live through it, it sort of changes your perspective. When you commit to net zero greenhouse gas, regardless of the time frame, and you start addressing how am I going to get there, the first thing that slaps you in the face is, I need to go work on methane right away. Two reasons is, and you'll hear about some today, is I know how to do it, and two is it's by far, of all the things the energy industry has to face, methane is by far the least expensive, by a lot. And so when the proposals on this near zero by 2030 came up, it seemed like an intuitive thing to do, but you might not know that when you go speak to smaller operators or assets even of ours that weren't as far along, and they'd say this just feels like incremental work or a burden when you sort of lay it out in a perspective of we're going to decarbonize anyway. Methane seems the obvious choice and something to go work on very quickly. So I'll leave
Awesome,
it at that.
great. We'll double click on some of those comments in a bit. Ulrike, please introduce yourself and your organization and your approach on the energy transition of methane.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks very much to the IGU and CRIN for setting this up. You wouldn't think it does need another methane event in this COP, but it feels great to have it on the very top of the agenda. And I've attended several COPs for Ipieca, and alone in the last couple of years seen a shift in how this topic has been addressed from very much a pledge state to the action mode and taking others on board to help them advance on this journey. Few words on Ipieca. We are a global industry association for the oil and gas industry. We have 45 member companies and around 35 association members. Two of our members being here on the stage with Ecopetrol, ExxonMobil. I've also seen members in the audience with Repsol, which is great because they all help us addressing this topic. We would be nothing without these subject matter experts who are getting involved in our association. We look at all topics related to sustainability for the oil and gas industry across the energy transition. So while you see that the sector is diversifying its activities, we also do that as an industry association. So we look at upstream, downstream, midstream, but also the alternative energy space in which companies are moving. That means renewable energy, wind, solar, but also the low carbon technology space to help the sector find solutions together, learn from each other, and move these things forward. Ipieca has a very special relationship with these UNFCCC climate conferences because we have been founded following the request by the UN Environment Programme almost 50 years ago, who needed a channel or wanted to have a channel after their own foundation to communicate with the oil and gas industry. The heritage at that point was in the oil spill space and very much focused on environmental issues, and it grew in the social space and then more and more in the climate space as well. So what we are looking at is climate, nature, people, and sustainability. And today, obviously, it's going to be focused on climate, and we are covering 3 parts in the climate space. Very much the operational improvement of the sector, so everything around methane emissions, flaring, but also then the new technology space with CCS, direct air capture, these things, and then the reporting side of things. If you want to improve, then you need to have the data and be measured on something, so that's something we very much look into and help the sector align on these things to be comparable and talk to stakeholders about these things and help our industry move into this space. I'm going to leave it here. I think we will have much more time to talk about what we're doing.
Perfect. A great introduction. Thank you, Ulrike. John, please introduce yourself and what your work is.
Certainly. So John O'Brien from Deloitte. I'm originally from the UK. I've lived in Australia for 25 years. I've lived in New York for the last 3 months. So you can tell with my broad New York accent. A lot of the work I do these days is with companies and countries and whole economies and financiers around setting their targets and then working out the least cost and most strategic way to meet those targets. But I've had a sort of a background. I started work on oil rigs in the North Sea, as maybe some others in here have. And I remember on a freezing night in the North Sea, you'd go outside to warm yourself up from the flare. And I just remember thinking, that seems like a waste of energy. Surely we could use that. I ran a gas network for a while, and we started reporting leaks, and it was like, there's a huge financial cost. 2.5% unaccounted for gas. It's like, that's a lot of money. So I've always kind of approached this, very much from a how do we reduce environmental damage, but taking it from a strategic and financial perspective. So how do we use technology and finance to enable stuff? Some of the other stuff, before I joined Deloitte, I spent 10 years developing clean technologies. I ran accelerators around the world. And since joining Deloitte, we've sort of done things like National Hydrogen Strategy in Australia, National Bioenergy Roadmap in Australia. Where are the industry development opportunities? Where are the jobs? How do we actually start decarbonising in economic ways, but keeping security and cost in place? And doing lots around that sort of stuff. So there's lots more, but that's enough for now.
Phenomenal. Pulling some of those threads in a bit. Okay, first question. We're 6 days into COP. The oil and gas decarbonization charter is perhaps an exciting event, but why do we need another charter as an industry? I'll start that one off with Santiago, and then I'll let Matthew comment.
So a couple of points. First, I don't think everyone in the industry is at the same level. So you have different levels of maturity. I think one of the attributes of this charter is that it sets a standard. It sets a North Star for those who are advanced, as well as for those who are trying to get ahead as well. So I think that's very valuable, and it helps with different stakeholders. I, for example, talk every week with financial institutions, and every week there's something different. Is saving the rainforest, or so there's a myriad of things that are being asked to you, but having some focus on the main issues regarding decarbonization, I think is very helpful because it puts the spotlight where it should be put. So that's, I would say, for me, the broadest contribution of that charter. And it sets a standard. It helps, for example, internally to keep pushing the boundaries because now we know where we're heading. So that in a nutshell would say that's my...
So I want to double click on that from an NOC perspective, because I think that actually what is unique about this one is not just sort of another net zero pledge, it's actually the number of NOCs that actually came to the table on that one, in the sense that, historically the NOCs have yet to be reticent to sign up to those types of pledges. Can you comment on Ecopetrol's perspective from an NOC?
Sure, and I think you're fully correct, and probably that's one of the biggest things happening now. 30 NOCs have joined that charter, so that is really, really significant. To think, and why is an NOC different in this space? I would say that simply that there are additional pressures that we need to balance. If you think about Ecopetrol, in the last 3 to 4 years, we've constituted around between 12 and 20% of the national budget of Colombia. So really, this is an industry that is contributing significant research to the country, and you cannot just shut it down from not one day to the other, because that can have a macroeconomic impact. So you need to balance those things out. From an NOC perspective, you also need to, at some point, figure out that there is a business case as well. It's not just important for the environment, because it is crucial, but there is also a business case in moving ahead in this space. By being more efficient, by reducing your methane emissions, by implementing renewables, you are becoming a more competitive company as well. You're having access to additional sources of capital. Your reputational risks diminishes as well. So there is a legitimate business case, and I'm not mentioning all the factors why you should be moving ahead in this space, but at the end of the day, you end up being a more competitive company who has a longer perspective in the long run. So that's how we are seeing it, and I hope that we can have that conversation with other NOCs, that this is not just about climate, it's also about seeing yourself in the future and being competitive in the future as well.
Yeah, well, especially when you have the vast majority of global production coming from NOCs, it's really nice to see that the IOCs are bearing the burden of all of this. Matthew, what are the three key pledges of the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, and what are the particular relevance to a major IOC like Exxon?
I will answer that. Let me just build on what.
Oh, you guys can have fun with this.
Deflect. I just want to build off that because I think it's a really important question that you were asking on why OGDC, why now, and I think your answer was spot on. Just to build on that, I think maybe not even fully comprehended that evolved over the last few months as this was being considered is there's two other components that were sort of pulled in at the last few weeks, which were less structured, but there's the announcement in the charter that we've gotten 52, and it sounds like many more coming based off these week's discussions. But secondarily, there's an ecosystem that has evolved very quickly between all the industry trade groups to form a capacity building network to go out and not only align sort of the differing performances among the signatories, but how can I go bring the whole industry up? And so while we've tried to do that, and I think we've been moderately successful, this again gives us a framework to build off. And then I think this was announced as sort of an antagonistic third piece of it, but I'm all for it, is Bloomberg funded $40 million, I think, to basically monitor our performance and make sure we're being held accountable. I'm all in, right? We're all in, and more people that are watching and paying attention, it's all good because methane's that important. Your question was, what is OGDC?
What are the three pillars of the commitment?
And I'll go quickly. I mean, and they're all sort of individually, they've been established programs. One is to aiming for zero methane by 2030, and so that's not absolute zero, but that's, again, that was developed under the context how our industry looks at safety or oil spills, with a tolerance going into how we run our businesses. This shouldn't happen. So we said methane is that important to us, so we should make all reasonable efforts to eliminate methane in our design, in our operations, and our maintenance. And so that's a big piece of it. That was launched, that concept was launched at Sierra Week in 2022, but now we've got this broad coalition around it, so I think that's going to really accelerate. The second one is, again, been around almost a decade, this zero routine flaring. The World Bank had started that initiative, sort of mixed success, but again, building it in this framework, I think that'll be accelerated. And then the final one was for your operated emissions for greenhouse gas, much broader, is by 2050 that you'll strive for net zero for that. And again, that's an important milestone for society and consistent with the Paris Accord. For me, why it's so important is it really sets a context for those first two is, hey, if I'm going to have to decarbonize those two things that the methane flaring, kind of no-brainers. I should go get those.
Fantastic. Now, just as a point of clarity, is this strictly a charter, or is there some sort of organizing body that manages this, or is this Bloomberg, as you mentioned?
No, and that's under development. And I know there's been a lot of discussions this week about how do I enforce it, and what if there's people that aren't living up to the expectation. And so there's two pieces of that. One is there will be a group, and it'll be industry and civil society participating on how do I go sort of manage this program, a secretariat. The other, and it'll be similar for an accountability, whether the Bloomberg commitment comes in or not. I think the other piece, and I just sat in a previous session that Harvard led on all the remote sensing that was coming about, and we've heard a lot about that this week, and there's been more initiatives in that space. There's not really any places to hide from your performance in this space, methane, flaring, or greenhouse gas. And so I think this will all be readily public available data in real time that we'll be able to monitor our performance.
You just need a subscription to GHGSat. Okay, that's a fantastic cue out for Ulrike. What is the role of an organization like Ipieca if, as the management body of OGDC, sorry, I'm just learning my alphabet soup after this whole week, plays in this, and how can we, drive accountability on these charter pledges? Because if we've had so many, it's clearly easier to have a pledge than it is a action. Thoughts there?
No, thanks for this question. And Ipieca has very much welcomed this new charter because it makes very transparent the commitment that is there. And I think it brings together a group with companies that have different stages on their journey on methane. I mean, we in Ipieca with our members have been working on methane emissions for many years already. So these folks have already been going up the learning curve, having shared with others. And it's very much now with companies that are now starting and having made this commitment and starting their journey to educate them and to share with them and to help them accelerate on this learning curve. And that's, I think, a lot of what companies like ExxonMobil and Ecopetrol, especially for the NOCs, can do to really help and showcase what kind of challenges are on the way, but also what things have been improved already. And I think there's a role for associations like Ipieca to play, but also, of course, for others. I mean, very much involved is OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, IRGP as the engineering-focused association, the International Oil and Gas Producers Association, to really help the sector to comply with these pledges. And I think what is important to note, and I mentioned we have been working on methane emissions for a long time, we're not starting at zero. There's so much material already available, so many resources, so many speeches that have been given and so on. So now I think the biggest task is to provide this to them, to the new starters or the ones who feel like they are closer to the starting point of the methane journey, to really get them prepared and get these quick wins in other companies have already had. So we very much welcome this and we are ready to support as Ipieca, and through the big network we have with our members we have. And also we have heard 52 members have signed up. We have 45 companies as members. Not everyone has signed up yet, and we are very much happy to promote this initiative with our membership, to explain, to bring experts in from companies who have already signed, to show the benefits and the difference that's going to make. And that's something that will resonate with stakeholders. I mean, we work a lot with the UN, with the investors, all sorts of stakeholders who want to gain trust with our industry. And I think the methane journey, there's something where we can have some quick wins, we can show change, we can show our commitment, and with that gain the trust for the future activities where we will need it, for hydrogen, for CCUS and all these technologies where we will be involved in the energy transition, but we need society's trust in us that we can perform.
It's interesting. It was just made me think, this morning I had a meeting with one of the lead negotiators on the OGCDC, and, his point was sort of very much that bringing the sort of NOCs and IOCs to the table was this game changer in the sense that, okay, only really at one previous COP have, the traditional energy producers sort of had a welcome seat at the table. And that's definitely been a shift without, not without controversy. But it's definitely, I think, brought about, in some regards, greater action and greater accountability. You guys have taken a much different approach than some organizations that, do advocacy. And then the accusation is that they're just, these types of statements are just greenwashing versus, and we're just advocating for, status quo, if you will. How would you comment, sort of broadly speaking, on your experience at this COP versus others, and also the role of how you take an accountability approach versus an advocacy approach at Ipieca?
Yeah, thanks for this. I'm going to refer a bit to what I said earlier. I think this COP, having many representatives from the business involved, is a chance to really show action. You need the business to showcase what is possible and what has business already been doing. So that's like really bringing evidence to the table. So I think it's very, very positive to be more inclusive, to show it, but also on the other hand, for business representatives to be here, and seeing is believing. When you see how much discussions are here and how the case for urgency is made, it makes a difference in the minds of people. And it's great to see many executives and leadership being here, because it shows they take it seriously. And I think that's very important when looking at the COP process. In terms of Ipieca's role, that's a very good point with the policy side of things. So I mentioned that we have this special relationship with the United Nations, and to maintain this as an oil and gas association is, of course, challenging. There are many stakeholders out there who think you couldn't sit at the table with the oil and gas industry. But if you want to improve the performance, you have to talk and you have to get into dialogue. But kind of our part of the deal is we are not getting involved in any lobbying activities. So we are not here to change anything in terms of negotiations. We are not getting involved. We are here to monitor and to share the experience with our membership, taking that back and giving back the sense of urgency during the COP processes. And we don't do that only at COP, but throughout the year. We provide the safe space for our members and stakeholders, and especially critical stakeholders, to have these discussions and to have this understanding without that you read about it in the press or anything, but really these honest discussions about what does it take, what is the special challenge NOCs have in certain things, especially when looking at methane emissions and competing for money for investing in improving technology with the country. So to like really provide these safe spaces, I think there's a big role to play, and we are not against lobbying or anything. There's a good benefit in providing the right policies to drive change, but we as Ipieca are not getting involved in this, and therefore we can provide these safe spaces.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think these safe spaces are the only way we're actually going to have it, and sometimes bridging that distance. I'm going to let John jump in with some thoughts, but I do have a follow-up for John.
Yeah, so one of my kind of views around pledges and sort of statements, particularly if you're looking at what's happening in the reporting world, and it depends on the country, of course, and the standards, but ISSB is sort of covering companies around the world. The SEC reporting regulations appear to be a bit stuck. We may have an election going in my home country these days, so I'm not sure that it'll come through. But actually, the Californian legislation is actually going to pick up everyone really in terms of compulsory reporting, and particularly where we're seeing sort of public statements by companies operating in the US with California, and then in Europe with the CSRD. Sort of pledges and statements and what's in the annual report and the sustainability report, it's kind of like, well, you're going to have to kind of live up to that. And then you look at sort of the climate litigation world, and obviously some of this kind of companies in this room are very familiar with that, but it's only increasing. So lots in the US, plenty in Australia, and elsewhere. So again, it's sort of going on. Companies are making pledges and commitments and having transition plans. It's kind of once you made the pledge, it's going to force action. So that's the value of the pledge. It's kind of, in some ways it doesn't need government regulation to drive it, because it's companies making public statements and will drive that through. So I think that's a really important part of the public statement is that it means you can't back out.
Yeah, for sure. And the question then I guess is sort of my follow-up is, you work with a broad cross-section of companies, not just sort of oil and gas companies. What's going to be your takeaways? You go back and speak with your clients in New York or Sydney as to the significance of this and the actions that they should follow up with.
Yeah, and I work across quite all sectors really, and methane is obviously more than just oil and gas. There's whatever the numbers are. Agriculture is actually the most, 25, and waste is there as well. So and obviously coal and other fossil fuels. That's oil obviously, and coal. Coal, gas, oil. I don't know. Is there another one? Don't know. And biomass. There's a little bit of biomass in there. So it kind of needs to go across all things, and it's. I think it comes back to how do you think about this in a least cost and most strategic way. And one of the exercises we've done with companies in all sectors, but particularly the resources sector, is almost how do you start thinking about the future and the timing of that future. So, there kind of is an endpoint to that future. Maybe, there's margins of disagreement on what that might be, and certainly disagreement and uncertainty on the time frame of that. Is it 5, 10, 20, 50 years to getting to that end state? But we kind of know what the end state is. So what we help companies do is actually start thinking through, okay, well, what would our business look like in 10 years' time under a number of different scenarios? We help companies think about their new energy businesses. We help thinking about reduction in their abatement strategies, and whilst you don't necessarily implement all those immediately, you do need to have a clear pathway of what it's going to look like. And then once you've got that pathway, both on abatement and growth of the new businesses, you then need to work out what the signals and signposts are for taking action, because you're not doing it all now. There's some stuff that's easy, there's kind of, it just stacks up, why didn't we do it before? There's some stuff that's actually pretty hard and it's going to take 5 years to get the infrastructure in place or more. And then there's stuff that's kind of needs R&D still, particularly in the agriculture sector, and open pit coal mining and things like that. So, but you kind of, so some of that you start immediately, but you then kind of have this pathway and you go, okay, so we know we're going to have to do these things. What signal do we need from the market? Is it a compliance? Is it my financiers talking? Is it actually a reporting requirement? Is it the carbon market hits X dollars? What's that trigger that says, okay, I know I'm going to need 3 years to implement that, and I need to think about what's the trigger 3 years out that's going to make me say yes? And I don't know when that is going to be. Is it next year? Is it in 5 years? Is it in 10 years? But I know what that trigger is. And then the kind of the worry goes out of how the hell are we going to do this? Because it's not easy. This is transforming a business. So you kind of, what are those pathways under what scenarios?
Yeah, I agreed. Like, actually, interestingly enough, the Canadian oil and gas industry sort of, I kind of voluntarily set a methane pledge and to reduce 45% methane emissions by 2025 and hit it 3 years early. And that was done through a proper incentive and technology structures, which I think gets to the next sort of question is, while Canada might be boasting about its 45% reduction 3 years ahead of schedule, do we start getting to a point where we just address all of the low fruit of what's there and then we're just left with high fruit, or is there medium fruit, I guess is the question, and how do we develop those technologies? Maybe from your perspective, because your Ecopetrol's emissions reduction story is actually very fascinating for at least me to learn, and some of the accomplishments you made.
So when you said that comment, the first thing that came to my mind were cost abatement curves. So that's how we determine what the low-hanging fruits are and what's more expensive. So we're actually finishing those analyses at the moment, and that will tell us where we should be investing in the next few years. One of the main lessons that we got from that abatement curve is that some of the projects that we were thinking about are being left to 2030. So we have a huge challenge in trying to bring all that forward that was being left out for the end. So that's the first thing. In terms of technologies, I would say things have been evolving dramatically in the past 3 years. So detection technologies are just are pretty much ready by now. And you have different kinds of technology. The challenge that now, I think it's determining the sweet spot, the right mix of technologies to use in your own operation. So we've tried satellite, we tried overflights, we're going to test drones now, but at some point you need to come out with the right answer. What's statistically relevant, so that you do not need to measure all the time. So that I think that for us, the challenge now is what is the mix of technologies and how when do you need to deploy that? You also then have the challenge of reconciling that information, bottom up, top down. That's another challenge that we're facing. I would say that reducing methane emissions in particular, that the technology is out there as well. So you have the vapor recovery unit, you have different ways of achieving that. Of course, there are challenges. Depends also on the fields. For example, we have some older fields that are dispersed, where you don't have high flows of methane. What do you do then? You cannot just take that methane and shift it to power. So you need to really understand what your assets are. So I think it's really being very granular to asset by asset to really understand what the best mix of technologies are for detecting these things and for managing and reducing those emissions. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I do want to do a bit of a follow-up, especially in the context of an NOC, because in Canada with those impressive methane emission reduction targets, the driving forces behind those have been regulatory or also investor confidence to maintain sort of their cost of capital as they sort of get tracked in this new ESG world. How do you get a positive NPV on some of these technologies? Perhaps with different of those two drivers.
Yeah. First, I'll talk about a little bit before and talk about regulation. I think with this, we started to move ahead of regulation. We started joining OGMP and doing all this before there was regulation in Colombia. We have it now, and that's helpful in two ways. It helps to enforce that internally, to tell my operator, look, this is not an initiative anymore. This is a regulatory compliant mandatory. And it helps me with my associates as well, with my non-operated assets now. It's not a voluntary thing, it's regulation. The trick with regulation is that when we started moving ahead with this, particularly tied to OGMP, we were much more rigorous and advanced than the regulation. Because when you come up with regulation, you need to apply it to everyone at different maturity levels. So we were much more ahead of that, and now the regulation came, and it's not as ambitious as we were proposing. So that then becomes an internal challenge. Why do you go above regulation? So this is the types of discussions that we're having. There are, to this date, not really any incentives to do that. So, or you may have some tax breaks that can help you in this. But really there is a challenge here, and I think that's why I think that funds, for example, like the one the World Bank has created and other funds that can help NOCs access some of those funds will be crucial, because not every project that you're developing here has an MPV, a positive MVP. I would say, and this is a rule of thumb, probably 20 to 30% of those projects will be NPV positive. The other ones are very cost effective, as you said. Compared to other alternatives, it's one of the most cost effective ways that we have. That doesn't mean they have a positive MVP.
Yeah.
It just means that they're the best alternative that you have compared to other more costly alternatives.
Yeah. And also just the savings in gas has also sort of been a big one. What I will say is, from the Canadian experience, when you meet your targets ahead of schedule, the government just raises the ambition of where you need to go next, and then you regret that maybe we should have gone from low bleed pneumatics to just zero bleed pneumatics. But the good part of that is it's driven a lot of incredible methane technologies in Canada, such as GHG-SATs. Spartan Controls has been an amazing advocate of a lot of these, and so we're here to help is my point. But Exxon is probably the most renowned energy company that is out there. How do you guys see this operating in different jurisdictions such as Canada and other international jurisdictions which maybe might not have the same drivers as others? And how do you get those technologies to NPV positive?
Yeah, and I should have had Santiago's questions because I like his really a lot.
Feel free
I
to
like mine
In case you
too.
guys haven't noticed, you can answer any question you want.
Yeah.
I just
I find you just ignoring the questions.
just effective. Just one line. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit to your question on how do you get to, is there medium fruit or high
Just high
reaching
fruit,
food?
yeah.
There's a lot of low fruit, and I would maintain, again, methane versus the broader greenhouse gas, it's all low-hanging fruit. Not to say there aren't some difficult engineering problems, and engine slip is sort of currently a pretty big challenge, right? We use a lot of engines in oil and gas production, and that gas doesn't get 100% combusted, and so it's a small slipstream, right? It's parts per million, but when you add that up times tens of thousands of engines across a region, that in the U.S. alone, I think it's 15 or 20% of the methane, and so that's an engineering problem. We're working with the vendors, some academics on low-cost catalysts and sort of post-combustion controls. Again, just to follow up, now trying to get to your question, but following up from his, I mean, there has been, for those of you not familiar, in North America, there's been an explosion of technology, and I'll give credit to the Environmental Defense Fund. They just, for whatever reason, it's their headquarters, they picked the United States to start advancing, working with academics, to start sampling, this is 2010, 2011, and saying, hey, there's a gap here in our understanding of where oil and gas methane is. And so that led to Department of Energy putting out research money through their ARPA-E program, which went to the academics and these small startups that responded. So we've got satellites and airplanes and drones and continuous terrestrial sensors that is exploded in North America. None of that's required by regulation. And if you go to Texas or New Mexico in the United States, there are dozens of airplanes that fly not 24/7, every daylight hour, either for a government, for an oil and gas operator, or for an NGO. All voluntary for now. Now we're hopeful that this new wave of regulations sort of adopts that. And we'll see once we get through all 1,700 pages. To go globally, I think it's less a technology advancement, because that's now sort of got critical pace. These are still small companies, and so how do I get these tiny 30-person companies in North America? And I know they're starting to pop up in Europe and Asia, but they're small. And so it is one of the opportunities for us as we sort of grow this OGDC community. We're going to need detection, mitigation technologies, and how do I scale that industry up? And so I think that's a huge opportunity for us to work across sectors.
Yes, and I do want to follow up that because it's a particular passion of mine. Is that you queued me up on that, Matt?
I did.
In the sense that you've got, if you look at the history of where a lot of the innovation happens in the energy industry, a lot of it actually came from the service side of the business. If you look at the shale revolution, which was the largest energy transition anyone in this room has lived through, especially from an emissions reduction perspective, that technology actually came from the service side of the business, and a leaky IP structure where you'd have a service company drill a well for one company, sort of walk across the street, get a little bit better, and through these advances, we were able to drill 6-kilometer long multilaterals now. And you've had a service sector that's been essentially broke for the last 7 years, to put it bluntly, and a lot of that, and then the innovation then started coming from the startup world. And we've got hundreds of these little pilots all over the place, and they can't, or a lot of them at least, are struggling to sort of punch through to the big plant scale stuff. How do we get that done? What's the role of an operator, a service company, or a startup in punching these technologies from their sort of pilot scale to their demo commercial scale?
I think that's a COP29 discussion. I mean, just because we'll need that much time to talk about it. I mean, and we were talking about this the other day too. I mean, one of the challenges is it is evolving so quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, we have got 25 technologies, detection technologies deployed around our Permian Basin asset. And we've committed to monitor, to your point about how frequently to deploy. When we committed to our Permian Basin to go net zero total greenhouse gas by 2030, the team independently, the business team, said, how am I going to do this? And they said, the only way I can get methane to zero is I have to monitor 24/7. And so we're going to commit across the basin to put continuous sensors on every asset. 700 sites, $20 million by the end of next year. But it's hard for us to get going because every week some new academic or some new 3 people come in and like, look what I got. And we're like, ooh, that's better.
Yeah.
And so we've just pulled the trigger and we just started putting stuff out, but we know we're going to we'll want to replace it. It's better, it's faster, it's cheaper, it's smarter. So that's one of the barriers, I think. There's IP issues, there's government control issues. I mean, some of the technologies we're using came out of the defense industry.
Yeah.
And honestly, there are still countries around that aren't real comfortable with you monitoring over their airspace and their industry. So I do think, again, OGDC is going to break down a lot of those barriers.
But to follow up on that, I think that's the pencil we need to sharpen as an industry is what are the sort of going to be the new sort of models for global industrial decarbonization that solves that sort of final piece, because we can't keep taking the approach that the Silicon Valley model of venture capital is going to allow us to scale methane technology like we have scaled Uber. It's going to be a fundamentally different risk-return structure, and I look forward to cracking that nut. But if you look at that from a collaboration perspective, where does that take our collaborations and Ipieca's work around coming up with new risk-return structures that can allow us to punch these needed technologies to the next step?
So I think I have 2 things to say, and I'm glad I get a question on technology as well, although I had said before I'm not a tech expert. But we as Ipieca have just partnered with IGP and OGCI to put together a toolkit for new starters in the methane space to have a decision tree on what kind of detection and quantification technology is the right one for me. Because as Matt just said, there are like so many out there, and alone ExxonMobil in like one area is deploying so many. But you need some help when you start with that. And alone through that project, which took us almost 3 years, we had many, many updates because of the advance of technology. And it really makes a difference where you operate. Are you offshore, onshore? Are you in a desert? Are you operating in like a cold, icy environment? So there's not one technology fits all, and you might want to have a broader overview, and then you have to use satellites or planes, or you want to be close to the facilities. So it's a very complex space to get involved, and this is where it all starts, because you need to find the leaks first, you need to find the emissions to do something about it. And I think collaboration will play a massive part, because companies and sectors will start bringing more transparency, and we'll we'll continue sharing data. And if someone deploys a satellite and finds a leak somewhere else, they're gonna get in touch with that operator or with that coal mine or waste area to make sure this is gonna be handled. And I think that's what will be so important, that it's about solutions and not just my facility or about sending someone an invoice for using this detection technology. It's really about how do we get the global methane emissions down. And I think that's not going to work without cross-sector collaboration, but also what we see in our industry. I mean, our companies are used to working together. They are operating together in joint ventures. They are organized in industry associations. There's this new OGDC charter, which might bring them together with companies they haven't been working with together. So there's a lot to gain out of this, out of these partnerships and collaboration. I think the most important thing is It's not about duplication. As long as you speak to each other, the more the merrier. Bring them all in, have more and more partnerships and collaboration as long as it does something good for emission reduction and driving the performance of our industry.
So I want to be a little contrarian on that, or at least have your perspective. I agree with you 100%, but your naysayers will say, okay, well, we constantly say we need to collaborate more. I've been on a panel that hasn't said that, and yet then sometimes corporations, are fundamentally structured in their own financial best interest, and if I can get, higher methane, lower my methane compared to my competitor, why am I going to want him to give him that competitive advantage? Because now his cost of capital has just gone up and mine's gone down. So how do we break through we know we need to collaborate, but then just all go back to our offices and, try and destroy the other side?
So I think every individual company will be measured by the worst performing member of the sector. So it doesn't help anyone if we have someone who's not trying to improve performance, because we do need the oil and gas production that is happening, and if someone is not performing well, that's not going to help anyone, and not society and not the sector. So it's, I think, and that's what we see in Ipieca a lot, is really companies are willing to share, and they are willing to have these open discussions and share challenges they had on the way. So from our companies in Ipieca, I said we have 45 member companies. 33 of them have some form of net zero targets by 2050. And that all started end of 2019. So there's a lot happened since 2019. And I've been in so many meetings where it was really about, you guys, how did you get there? How were you able to really say this is going to happen in 2050? What did your investors say about this? What did other stakeholders say? What did your regulators say? And it was really about this honest dialogue. And there was, of course, there is. You can be proud if you have a good performance, and you will see the best sustainability reports by every single company, and they are not going to say, well, look at my competitors, they are good as well. Fair enough. But the industry and the individual in the industry is going to win if the sector performs well.
I agree, and I think we've just signed a sort of coalition of the willing between the IOCs, NOCs, and Ipieca on solving for the next piece of the puzzle is coming up with new financial structures in a new collaborative model that allows us to get these industrial technologies to market. There's nothing like certain volatility that gets management consultants super excited. It's like manna from heaven. Solve this for us, John.
Sure, when's the deadline? Just,
in 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay, no problem. Yeah, that's fine. Coming back to scaling technology, because you just asked me a question that I'll answer in a minute. But it's one of the reasons why you need to scale, how and why you'll scale technology is actually sort of the supply chains for everyone in the methane sector, oil and gas being one of them, are going to demand transparency and traceability of product, and actually tracing that through, and every invoice is going to have an emissions number on it as well as a dollar number, and that's all going to flow through, and things like there was the net zero data utility was launched last week, I can't remember, but it's sort of open sourcing all the data from transition plans. There's things like the Transition Plan Task Force in the UK that's done some really good work on what's a good transition plan, and it's different regions. It's becoming sort of, I don't know, quite usual in the UK and Australia a little bit, and not really coming to the US yet, and some other regions not. But every company will have a transition plan, and so I think there's sort of a whole lot of transparency that's coming on all of this, and monitoring and scaling of that technology is just going to be necessary. It doesn't have to be perfect, is the other thing, particularly in engineering companies. I'm an engineer, but yeah, things have to be perfect, and it's like, all right, we're not going to get perfect, don't worry about it. It's okay, let's get 80% of the way there, and yes, the technology will improve, and that's fine, and the data will improve, but we have to start somewhere. So I think that'll drive through, kind of some of the micro monitoring, the real sort of small monitors for methane that can all be sort of IoT and wireless and kind of you actually put it on the whole plant, and so you suddenly get a lot more insights. And then on collaboration, I mean, I think on the financing side, there's some sort of really interesting stuff on, clearly there's kind of government action and all the levers of government and capital subsidies and feed-in tariffs and tax credits and R&D support, so that's part of it. There's some interesting stuff happening with philanthropy at the moment and some of the really big philanthropic funds, and I've had a conversation with some of them in the World Economic Forum about PPPs, public-private philanthropic partnerships. And so how does the philanthropic funding come in and take the first loss and take, just reduce the risk enough? You've got government sort of providing, some capital subsidy or regulation. The philanthropic can take the next layer, and then that allows the private sector to come in and take the amount of risk that they're happy to take at that return. And so that's a really interesting, kind of movement forward. And do we see transition bonds coming through in that? And then maybe lastly on sort of the collaboration, a couple of the projects I'm involved with. So in Australia, we've set up a group called the Climate Leaders Coalition. So it has the energy companies, oil and gas, it has building, it has property, it has very much cross-sector. And they're solving or trying to solve pre-competitive problems. So every company is going to have the same problem. How do you, scope 3, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare for everybody. It's a different shaped nightmare for everybody. Sometimes it's upstream, sometimes it's downstream, but it's a nightmare. So where do you start with that? They've done some projects on where do you start with nature? We launched a paper last week around credible transition plans. How do you actually do transition plans, but think a bit more broadly around the company strategy and how do you do that? And that's all sort of the pre-competitive stuff. And so in some ways, collaborating outside of the sector is sometimes easier on some of this stuff. Because people who've been in leadership positions for a long time have been successful because they've been competitive and won, and they've divided up the pie and they've got a bigger bit of pie, and it's now around the pie's changing shape or it's getting bigger. So how do we actually help each other change where things are going and do that pre-competitive stuff?
Okay, I really want to double click on that 4 Ps thing because that's sort of the first time I've kind of heard that. What's the difference between a philanthropic fund and either impact fund or a charity? And then kind of following up on that, what could we learn from the Vicky funds, the venture capital catalyst investment funds that were just so successful in the tech industry, whereby government stepped in with a sort of first in, last out investment approach, thereby de-risking some of these high-risk technologies to ensure a more stable return for private investors. But they were talking about $10 million investments, not billion.
Well, that's it. I mean, that's basically different. There's no difference. It's just sort of different layers of first loss. If government wants to take it all, fine, but maybe they're not going to come in with $1 billion. It's kind of another layer, and because this is hardware and it's massive capex and massive investment in billions of dollars, it kind of government generally isn't going to go that far. So can you bring in another layer?
Huh, fascinating. I think you just signed up for the team for COP29, John. My mind is racing. Maybe just sort of pivoting, I think, from, we've covered technology, we've covered, investment. Touching, I guess, on the final piece of the puzzle is sort of regulation. Canada and the United States have come out with some pretty ambitious new regulations. The Canadian oil industry has just said that their methane emissions of 45% reduction was done with $600 million cheaper than had it been regulated. How do we strike the right balance in light of these new commitments that have been made? Do you need a stick and a carrot, or do you just need a carrot? I'll let anyone jump at that one.
I think you need both, I think, and I have grown on this topic over the last few years. I mean, we were pretty adamant that the answer was regulation to get this accelerated, and I still think that's true. The reality of global politics sort of sunk in and said that's not going to happen overnight, and we just living through the U.S. experience, we saw the federal methane rules sort of be proposed, disappear for 4 years, come back. But we've seen a wave, right? U.S., Canada, Nigeria, EU, and their rule may impact every country that produces and imports gas to them. And I think there's value in that, right? It sets a standard. It can be science-based. We've learned a lot in the countries that have had regulations for a while. There's things that work regardless of, and you could just set it at a minimum, a bare standard. We'll see in the U.S., right? They've given us carrots and sticks. We're 24 days away from being subject to a tax for the first time in global history on methane.
On methane. Was that part of the new methane regulations, or is that something else?
That's part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Oh, I didn't realize there was a stick in the Inflation Reduction
And
Act.
even in the tax, there's a carrot that says, hey, once you go implement all these new rules consistently across the country, you're not subject to the tax anymore. And so that, a very clever stick that says, I'll quit hitting you if you behave. We'll see. I mean, again, very clever legislation.
You have no idea how envious we are of it in Canada. You want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, if I can. So I would say that in emerging economies, you have less carrots. So we would love to have an Inflation Reduction Act to promote the energy transition, but it's never going to happen. So you need to come up with very clever regulations to make this as cheap as possible for the regulated environment. And I think I touched upon finding the right balance between those who are ahead and those who have nothing. I think Colombia did a right job in that regard, and something that I find very interesting is that it regulated not only methane but flaring reductions, and I think that's in one piece of regulation, and I think that made a lot of sense. And talking about collaboration, that was the result of a very close close collaboration with the people behind OGMP. So that in itself was very interesting, because the standard was about to come up, but they went ahead and talked to the government and came up with a piece of regulation that makes the regulation and the OGMP standard sort of coincide, which I thought was very interesting.
John, are you okay? You want to jump on that one?
On the stick and carrot. So what do we need? So you do need both, undoubtedly in some ways. So you've got to have the backstop. You've got to kind of and keep pushing that forward. If we want to get to a world that does have a stable climate, which we will, we just might prefer it to be one stable climate as opposed to another. But it's there has to be regulation. It has to push things along. It has to be a level playing field, so everyone kind of moves to some extent at the same pace, or at least the same minimum pace. But it's for the last 20 years, if you play this right, there's a lot of money to be made. So this is good stuff, and if you play it wrong, there's a lot of money to be lost, and it's about timing. So you need to be making sure that you're building the new businesses that are meeting demand. And that the incentives are there, and the carrot's there, and it's pulling that through. And as a business, you need to be kind of thinking around what are the financial risks in this under different scenarios, running those scenarios, whether and kind of one of the challenges I often have with companies is, okay, we're going to do some scenarios on possible futures, and you kind of and it's kind of plausible possible futures. It's not predictions. It's not that we're likely to get to one of these four worlds. It's kind of like they're all plausible. They're not impossible. It's kind of we want to sort of test the edges of where your strategy is, and is it going to survive under those possible futures? And some are in the middle, and it's not a sensitivity. It's not plus or minus 10%, plus or minus 20%. It's different worlds working different ways. And is your company strategy going to be robust under all of those? And that's where it gets really fun. And again, working with companies, they're going, but can we just do sort of, take a forecast and do plus or minus 20%? It's like, you can, but that's not going to help you, because that means that you're not kind of doing war games on your strategy to actually make sure your company is going to survive through transition at whatever pace that happens.
Fascinating. Ulrike, you want?
Yes,
Care
I
to say?
think, as I said, we are not getting involved in regulations and policy making. But what is interesting for us and our members is we have a global membership and very diverse membership in terms of companies and also countries in which they operate. We do have a high interest in guidance documents for voluntary action because some companies are operating in jurisdictions where they don't have clear rules and regulations, but they want to compete in a global market and they want to have access to global stakeholders, and then they are measured on these regulations which they don't have in some areas. So that's an interesting one where really we are sharing a lot about what's happening afterwards. So how are companies implementing, what are things that can be done, what are quick wins in this, because there's high interest to learn like from the global trends in the regulation space.
Fantastic. Okay, final question, and maybe is a bigger picture question. I was at a dinner last night with a bunch of renewable individuals after spending much of my week with much of the more traditional energy people. And so the conversation was how last COP at Charm was a conversation around the molecule. How were we going to use hydrogen, carbon capture, and it was very much the molecule side of the energy transition. Whereas they were saying, you know, despite some of the statements that have been made, the market is actually this year showing the power of the electron in the energy transition. Solar prices continue to fall to the point that they're sort of competing even against brownfield gas, and that we're sort of just going to leapfrog the energy transition in the global south, you know, very much pushing a, you know, 20, 30 million barrel a day scenario by 2050. You can walk over to the other parts of COP and they'll present you a much different oil forecast demand scenario that also reaches a net zero 2050. How do you guys square the two different bubbles here at COP? Because I haven't. Well, I go to both events, I just haven't figured out one consistent thread.
So I'll start maybe, they're plausible futures. So, you know, kind of as a company, you need to be able to thrive in all of those futures because any of them could be happening. In terms of the molecule, you know, so hydrogen we'll definitely be using hydrogen for some things. We're not going to have a hydrogen economy. The economics are tough. It will get cheaper, but we will be using it for some things, particularly hard to abate. You know, it's probably going to sort of help with the sustainable aviation fuel feedstocks. It's going to sort of potentially help with sort of steel and elsewhere in chemicals. So and heavy transport. You know, there's Andrew Forrest has got a hydrogen boat down at Dubai Marina this week that he's promoting. And so it's kind of, we'll definitely be using hydrogen. Is it going to be everything? There's some challenges with the blending into gas pipelines. You know, it's kind of its energy density is pretty low. It's the molecules are much smaller. They leak more. The global warming potential of leaked hydrogen is very high, even higher than methane. So there's some challenges with that. So it kind of needs to be dedicated if you're going to do hydrogen. Biomethane is, you know, the other option on molecules and biofuels and bioenergy more broadly. We did a really interesting piece for Australia and looking at effectively feedstock constraints and all the different technologies and use cases and the techno-economics and paths of all of those against incumbents. You know, we can actually probably, for Australia, you know, a very specific example, but you can probably get to 25% of primary energy across, you know, feedstocks and waste stocks, but you want to be very, very selective of how you use those. You don't, because there's a whole lot of low-value uses. You've got to be solving the hard problems with the bioenergy, which is not necessarily the most commercial. So we're going to kind of need a bit of everything, and CCS is another thing. So there's no silver bullet here. You know, fusion's definitely on the way. Apparently, it's about 10 years away. I do recall watching Tomorrow's World in the 70s. I think that's what they said then as well. So it's, you know, we have no silver bullets. We have to run everything in parallel.
Anyone else want to jump on the two worlds?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
No, I was just gonna.
I stole your question before.
No, I was just gonna. I'm just gonna echo what you said. I mean, I think you right, and that's what we're doing. And you see a lot of our peers, you just got to build your business model and try not to pick a winning scenario. I mean, we do our own energy outlook that's pretty consistent with the international reports to drive our core business, but we've designed our business to say if it goes slower, we're ready. If it's faster, we're ready. If the policies come in to support a faster transition, we'll be ready to actively participate. And so I just think that's the way that this industry is going to have to position it.
Yeah.
In our
Santiago?
case, I don't think it's a question of if, but when. When do you invest in these things? And I'm going back to my abatement curves. Does it make sense to invest in hydrogen right now? Probably not. Do we want to be the first players in this space? Probably not. We might have to wait, but we want to be ready when that happens. That means keeping understanding how that would evolve in our own space, understanding what our competitive advantage is in Colombia with our infrastructure, the current infrastructure, etc. So it's really paying attention to this, but also there's a fundamental question of when. When do you invest?
And I think, and how much do you lose if you lose the first mover
And how much?
advantage is
Yeah,
the question. 'Cause
exactly.
you can't be last, but you can't be, necessarily.
It's really understanding your own position in your...
Yeah. Okay, with 4 minutes or less, I've been told I have to keep to a very tight schedule. One sentence on how you're leaving COP. Optimistic, depressed, tired, each one of you.
All of the above.
So,
The hardest question, you guys.
so
Oil demand scenarios are way easier, apparently.
I'll claim to have invented the phrase being a stubborn optimist. So I'm optimistic because there's no other choice. And I don't accept the versions of the future world that are not very good and kill hundreds of millions of people. So I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. There is some very positive signs around good progress. There's some good investment happening. There's a lot of push for fossil fuel phase out. We won't get all the way on that. We'll get a decent way, and that's going to send some interesting signals across the industry.
Way more than one sentence, John.
Had a lot of ands. Had a lot of ands in there, I'm sure.
For me, it's I'm hopeful, and I'm looking forward to what's about to happen next year, because we can't wait until the next COP to continue these discussions. We now need to get in the full action mode. So although we are all exhausted, for sure, it's going to start immediately when we come home.
Fantastic. Still more than one sentence.
I'm going to do 1.5. We came to this global international conference and I felt unified, which is a rarity.
I would say relatively optimistic and proud, because I think that OGDC for us was the consolidation of what we've done for the past year. What we've done in the 4 years allowed us to get here, and so that's.
Yeah. I would concur. I came to this actually thinking it was going to be a total disaster from an outcome perspective, and halfway through I'm invigorated and inspired. And I think we already know the agenda for the next COP, and potentially the UAE maintains the presidency. So we'll see how we can figure out these 4 Ps to punch and scale through these technologies and advance these many important conversations in a certainly volatile future. So on behalf of the International Gas Union and CRIN, I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists for joining in this important conversation today as we advance the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. And I will call this UNFCCC side event to a close. Thank you for joining us.